A Labrador rescues a stranded kayaker. How it happened will amaze you. The soft glow of dawn spread across Lake Evergreen, painting the water in hues of gold and pink. A light mist hovered over the surface, curling and dancing like an ethereal veil as the first rays of sunlight broke through the dense canopy of trees. Sarah adjusted her grip on the paddle, her breath fogging in the chilly morning air. This was her favorite time of day, when the world was still and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against her kayak and the occasional call of a loon echoing across the lake. She inhaled deeply, the crisp scent of pine mingling with the damp, earthy aroma of the lake. This solo journey wasn't just another kayaking trip. It was a chance to find herself again. The past year had been a whirlwind of disappointment and loss. Her divorce had left her questioning everything. She thought she knew about herself, and for months she'd felt adrift, as if her life had lost its anchor. The lake, with its quiet strength, had become her sanctuary. As Sarah paddled further from the shore, her gaze lingered on the dense forest that lined the lake. Towering pines swayed gently in the breeze, their needles whispering secrets to one another. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though she dismissed it as a trick of her mind, a remnant of the unease that had clung to her since the storm warnings the night before. Unbeknownst to Sarah, a pair of sharp, watchful eyes followed her every move from the shadowed shoreline. Max, a sleek black Labrador with a coat that gleamed like polished obsidian, stood motionless among the trees. His ears twitched as he observed the lone kayaker slicing through the water with rhythmic precision. To anyone else, Max might have seemed like just another dog, but those who knew him recognized the uncanny intelligence behind his gaze. Max had lived by Lake Evergreen for as long as anyone in the nearby town could remember. Rescued as a puppy by an old fisherman named Joe, the dog had grown up learning the rhythms of the lake, the rise and fall of its tides, the hidden currents that could sweep the unwary into danger, and the subtle shifts in the air that foretold incoming storms. Max sniffed the wind, his nose twitching as he caught a faint metallic tang that signaled trouble. He let out a low whine, his instinct screaming that something was wrong. Turning his head, he glanced back toward the small cabin, where Joe was still sleeping, blissfully unaware of the growing tension in the air. Max's body tensed, every muscle coiled like a spring. He would not abandon his post, not when the lake whispered its warning so clearly. Sarah's kayak glided into the open expanse of the lake, the shoreline receding into the distance. She paused for a moment, letting her paddle rest across her knees as she admired the view. The water was smooth as glass, reflecting the sky so perfectly it was as though she were floating between two worlds. But even as she marveled at the beauty around her, a flicker of unease prickled at the back of her mind. The clouds had begun to gather on the horizon, their edges tinged with an ominous grey. The weather app had assured her that the storm wouldn't arrive until late afternoon, giving her plenty of time to enjoy the lake and return to shore. But now, watching the way the clouds seemed to grow and churn as if alive, she wasn't so sure. A sudden gust of wind rippled across the water, sending a shiver down Sarah's spine. She reached for the small waterproof bag at her feet, pulling out a thermos of coffee. The warm liquid offered a brief comfort as she took a sip, but it did little to quell the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. Back on shore, Max began to pace, his movements restless and agitated. His keen senses picked up on the shifting energy of the lake, the way the wind seemed to rise and fall unpredictably, the way the birds had gone silent as if holding their breath. He let out a sharp bark, his voice cutting through the stillness. Sarah froze mid-sip, her eyes scanning the distant shoreline. She thought she heard a faint sound, a dog barking, but dismissed it as her imagination. The lake was vast, and sound had a way of playing tricks on you out here. She shook her head and set the thermos aside, gripping the paddle once more. "Focus, Sarah," she muttered to herself. "It's just a little wind. You've done this 100 times before." But as she pushed forward, the wind began to pick up, scattering the mist and sending small ripples across the once still surface. The clouds loomed closer now, their once soft edges growing jagged and dark. Max broke into a run, his powerful legs propelling him along the shoreline. He barked again, louder this time, his voice a desperate warning to the kayaker, who was now little more than a speck on the water. But Sarah was too far away to hear him, her focus locked on the approaching storm. The first raindrop splashed onto her arm, cold and startling. She looked up just in time to see a fork of lightning streak across the sky, illuminating the clouds in a dazzling but terrifying display. The storm was moving faster than she'd anticipated. Panic began to claw at the edges of her mind as the wind grew stronger, whipping the water into small, choppy waves. She turned the kayak toward the shore, her arms straining against the sudden resistance. But the lake, once so serene, had become a living thing, a restless, thrashing beast determined to keep her in its grasp. On the shore, Max skidded to a halt, his chest heaving as he watched Sarah struggle against the growing waves. He barked. Again, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the air. And then, without hesitation, he plunged into the water. The cold bit into Max's sleek body as he swam, his powerful legs churning through the rising waves. Every instinct told him to turn back, to stay safe on the shore, but he ignored them. The lake had taken lives before, and he would not let it claim another, not while he still had strength left in him. Sarah's kayak lurched violently to one side as a particularly strong wave struck it. She gripped the edges, her knuckles white, as she tried to steady herself. The storm was upon her now, its fury unleashed in a cacophony of thunder, rain, and howling wind. She didn't see Max approaching, his dark form cutting through the water. With relentless determination, the world seemed to narrow around her, just the storm, the kayak, and the icy grip of fear. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of movement. At first, she thought it was debris, another piece of flotsam tossed about by the waves. But as it drew closer, she realized it was something alive. A dog Max reached her, just as another wave crashed over the kayak, nearly tipping it. He barked sharply, his voice cutting through the roar of the storm like a lifeline. Sarah stared at him, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "Hold on!" she shouted, though she wasn't sure who she was talking to, herself or the dog. Max swam closer, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt. He wasn't just a dog, he was her chance, her only chance. The small town of Clearwater was a place where time seemed to move a little slower. Nestled between sprawling forests and the shimmering expanse of Lake Evergreen, it was the kind of town where everyone knew each other's name and gossip traveled faster than the morning mail. Sarah had moved here a year ago, leaving behind the bustle of the city and the memories of a life she no longer wanted to hold on to. Her house, a quaint cabin with a green roof and flower boxes filled with bright red geraniums, sat at the edge of the forest, overlooking the lake. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a porch with a creaky rocking chair, but it was enough. For Sarah, it wasn't about the size of the house, but the sense of freedom that came with it. Here she could breathe. Mornings in Clearwater had become Sarah's favorite part of the day. They started early, often before the sun had fully risen. She'd brew herself a pot of strong coffee, the rich aroma filling the cabin as she laced up her hiking boots. Max, the black Labrador she'd come to know from her walks along the lake, often appeared at the edge of her property, wagging his tail as if inviting her to join him. Sarah didn't own Max. Technically, no one did. He was the lake's dog, a free spirit who seemed to belong to everyone and no one at the same time. He was always around, whether accompanying local fishermen as they cast their nets or sitting patiently outside the town's bakery, waiting for a treat from the baker's daughter. His presence had become a comforting constant in Sarah's life, though she never quite understood why he seemed to linger near her more than anyone else. On this particular morning, Sarah sat on the porch, cradling her coffee mug as the first light of dawn painted the lake in soft hues of pink and orange. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the scent of pine and the faint, sweet smell of wildflowers. She closed her eyes, letting the stillness seep into her, a balm for the restless energy that had plagued her for months. The lake had become her sanctuary, a place where she could forget the past and focus on the present. Its vastness reminded her of life's endless possibilities, while its depths spoke to the mysteries she had yet to uncover. Every ripple, every gust of wind that danced across its surface seemed to whisper secrets, urging her to keep moving forward. Her divorce had left scars, not just on her heart, but on her sense of self. For years, she'd built her identity around her marriage, her role as a wife, a partner, a homemaker. When it all crumbled, she was left with a hollow ache and the daunting task of rebuilding from the ground up. Clearwater, with its simple rhythms and unpretentious charm, had offered her a lifeline. The townspeople had welcomed her warmly, though they'd quickly learned she wasn't one for idle chatter. Sarah was polite, but reserved, preferring to spend her time exploring the lake and its surrounding trails, rather than joining the weekly bingo games at the community center. The locals respected her solitude, and in return, she'd begun to feel a sense of belonging she hadn't expected. Max trotted up the path, his black coat gleaming in the soft light. Sarah smiled as he approached, setting her mug on the porch. "Railing. Morning, Max," she said, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. His tail wagged furiously, and he leaned into her touch, his eyes bright with the unguarded affection only a dog could offer. Max had become her silent companion on many of her adventures. She often wondered about his past, about the life he'd lived before he became the lake's guardian. The townsfolk had plenty of stories about him, tales of his uncanny ability to sense storms before they arrived, his knack for finding lost hikers, and even the time he'd saved a child who had fallen into the lake. "Looks like another good day," Sarah murmured, glancing toward the horizon. A few wispy clouds dotted the sky, but they were far from threatening. She finished her coffee and stood, stretching her arms above her head. The kayak rested on a rack by the water's edge, its bright red paint a stark contrast against the greens and blues of the landscape. It had been a birthday gift to herself, a symbol of her decision to embrace the life she wanted, rather than the life she'd felt trapped in. Kayaking had quickly become her favorite way to explore the lake, offering a sense of peace and perspective she couldn't find anywhere else. As she walked down to the water, Max followed, his tail wagging as he darted ahead to sniff at the reeds. The lake was calm, its surface like glass, reflecting the sky so perfectly it was as if the world had been turned upside down. Sarah ran her fingers along the edge of the kayak, feeling the cool, smooth surface beneath her fingertips. "You coming with me today, Max?" she teased, glancing at the dog. He barked once, his ears perking up as if he understood her words. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Didn't think so." Sliding the kayak into the water, she climbed in, the motion practiced and fluid. The paddle felt familiar in her hands, an extension of herself as she pushed off from the shore. The water rippled around her, the kayak slicing through it with ease. As she paddled out into the lake, Sarah felt the weight of the world begin to lift. Here, surrounded by nature's quiet beauty, she could forget the things that had broken her and focus on the things that made her whole. But even as she lost herself in the rhythmic motion of paddling, a faint unease tugged at the edges of her mind. The sky, so clear moments ago, seemed to hold a strange tension, as if it were waiting for something. On the shore, Max watched her go, his gaze unwavering. The dog's instincts, honed by years of living in harmony with the lake, told him something was coming. something that would test the strength of both the woman and the bond they were only beginning to forge. The lake stretched wide and serene, its surface mirroring the pale blue sky above. Sarah paddled further from the shore, savoring the crisp air and the rhythmic splash of her paddle cutting through the water. She glanced back once at Max, still seated on the shore, his form a black silhouette against the vibrant green backdrop of the forest. His watchful gaze followed her, a small pang of comfort and companionship she carried as she ventured deeper into the lake. The hours slipped by as Sarah explored the lake's quiet inlets, places where the water was shallow and clear enough to see the pebbles lining the bottom. She paused in the middle of the lake, letting the kayak drift. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a loon in the distance, and then it began. At first it was subtle, a faint gust of wind that sent ripples across the water. Sarah glanced up, noting the clouds gathering on the horizon. They were darker than the ones she'd seen earlier, tinged with grey and moving quickly. "Looks like I've got company," she murmured, dipping her paddle back into the water to turn the kayak toward the shore. But the wind was growing stronger now, whipping across the lake and ruffling the surface into a chaotic pattern. The calm serenity was replaced by a restless energy that set Sarah on edge. She quickened her strokes, but the water seemed to resist her. Each paddle met with more resistance. The storm came fast, too fast. Within minutes the sky turned ominous, the sun swallowed by heavy clouds that seemed to thicken with every passing moment. The air grew colder, and the first drops of rain splattered against Sarah's face. "Okay, this isn't good," she muttered, her voice swallowed by the rising wind. She fought to stay calm, focusing on her strokes and the distant outline of the shore. But the waves were rising now, slapping against the sides of the kayak and throwing her off balance. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring her vision and making it harder to see her path. A sudden gust of wind caught her off guard, tipping the kayak precariously. She gasped, leaning hard to one side to counterbalance the force. Her paddle slipped from her hands, vanishing into the turbulent water. "Damn it!" Panic clawed at her chest as the kayak wobbled violently, the waves growing larger and more menacing. She struggled to steer without the paddle, but it was a losing battle. The kayak lurched sideways, and in an instant she was plunged into the icy depths of the lake. The cold was a shock, seizing her lungs and sending her heart racing. She surfaced, gasping for air, her arms flailing as she tried to grab hold of the overturned kayak. The rain pelted her face, the wind howling in her ears. "Help!" she screamed, her voice hoarse and barely audible over the storm. Her mind raced, her survival instincts kicking in as she clung to the edge of the kayak. But the waves were relentless, each one pulling her farther from the shore. Her muscles burned from the effort, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as the cold sapped her strength. She thought of Max, safe on the shore, and a pang of regret pierced her heart. She had ventured too far, underestimated the power of the lake and its mercurial moods. A flash of lightning lit up the sky, illuminating the chaos around her. She caught a brief glimpse of the distant shore, now impossibly far away. The realization hit her like a blow. She was alone, adrift in the storm, with no one to help her, but she wasn't alone. Through the cacophony of the storm, a sound reached her ears. A bark, her head jerked up, her eyes scanning the churning water. There, slicing through the waves with determined precision, was Max. His sleek black form was a stark contrast against the frothy whitecaps, his powerful strokes propelling him toward her with incredible speed. "Max!" she cried, her voice breaking with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The dog reached her in moments, his sharp eyes locking onto hers as he swam around the kayak. He barked again, as if to reassure her, before nudging the kayak with his nose. Sarah clung to the edge, her grip weakening as the cold seeped deeper into her bones. Max swam closer, positioning himself beside her and offering a steadying presence. "Good boy," she whispered, her teeth chattering. Good boy. Max nudged her arm, his movements urging her to act. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Sarah reached out and grabbed onto his thick, wet fur. Max didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He turned and began to swim, towing her and the kayak through the raging water. The journey to shore was agonizingly slow. The storm fought them every step of the way, the waves pushing them back as often as they moved forward. Sarah held on tightly, her faith in Max the only thing keeping her from succumbing to the despair threatening to overwhelm her. At one point, a particularly strong wave nearly tore her from Max's side. But the Labrador was relentless, his strength and determination unwavering. He barked sharply, urging her to hold on, to keep fighting. When they finally reached the shallows, Sarah felt her feet touch the sandy bottom. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the rain as she stumbled. Forward, Max by her side. They collapsed together on the shore, the storm still raging around them. Sarah wrapped her arms around Max, her body trembling with cold and exhaustion. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You really saved me." Max licked her face, his tail wagging weakly. His eyes, filled with a mix of exhaustion and triumph, met hers, and in that moment, Sarah felt an unshakable bond form between them. The storm raged on, but for Sarah, the worst had passed. Max, her unlikely savior, had brought her back from the brink, proving that even in the darkest moments, hope could shine through. The rain eased to a gentle drizzle, but the sky remained a moody grey as Sarah and Max lay on the shore, their chests heaving with exhaustion. The wind still whispered across the lake, though its earlier fury had dwindled. Sarah's body ached, her limbs trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. Max, lying beside her, looked equally spent. His sleek black coat was soaked, his breaths coming in slow, laboured puffs. Despite his exhaustion, his eyes never left her. It was as though he understood the magnitude of what had just happened, his unwavering gaze a silent assurance that he would always be there for her. "Max, you incredible dog," Sarah murmured, her voice cracking with emotion. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his wet fur. "How did you know?" Max's tail wagged weakly, a flicker of joy amidst the aftermath of the storm. It was only when Sarah tried to stand that she realized just how battered her body was. Her legs buckled beneath her, the cold and strain leaving her too weak to support her own weight. She fell back to her knees, her hand gripping Max's collar for stability. "I can't believe I'm alive," she said aloud, more to herself than to Max. Max nudged her arm gently, his way of encouraging her to keep going. Sarah glanced down at him, his eyes filled with an intelligence that sent a shiver down her spine. There was something almost human in his gaze, an unspoken understanding that transcended words. With Max's help, Sarah managed to crawl further from the waterline, where the sand was dry and the air slightly warmer. She sat there for a moment, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. Max stayed close, his body pressed against hers, as if to shield her from the chill. "Okay," she whispered, taking a deep breath. "We need to get out of here." Her mind raced, trying to piece together a plan. Her kayak was still floating near the shore, overturned and battered by the waves. Her paddle was gone, and with it, any hope of making it back across the lake. Her phone was likely ruined, soaked beyond repair. "We're stranded," she said, the weight of the realization settling over her like a heavy blanket. Max stood, his ears perked as he scanned their surroundings. His stance was alert, his nose twitching as he caught scents carried by the wind. He barked once, a sharp, commanding sound that broke the stillness. "What is it, Max?" Sarah asked, following his gaze. The dense forest loomed behind them, its shadows deep and foreboding. Sarah had always avoided venturing too far into the woods. It was easy to get lost, and the thought of wandering through the thick underbrush had always seemed more trouble than it was worth. But now, with no other options, the forest seemed like their only chance. Max barked again, his tail wagging as he took a few steps toward the tree line. He glanced back at Sarah, his expression urging her to follow. "You think we'll find help in there?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. Max let out a low whine, his eyes pleading. Sarah hesitated, glancing back at the lake. The storm had calmed, but the water was still choppy, and the distant shore seemed impossibly far away. Even if she managed to get the kayak upright, she doubted she had the strength to paddle back. "Okay," she said finally, pushing herself to her feet. With a grunt, "Lead the way, Max." Max bounded ahead, his energy seemingly renewed. Sarah stumbled after him, her legs protesting with every step. The forest swallowed them quickly, its dense canopy casting a dim light over the narrow trail. The woods were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves absent in the wake of the storm. Sarah shivered, her damp clothes clinging to her skin as the chill seeped into her bones. Max moved with purpose, his nose to the ground as he followed an invisible trail. He paused occasionally, his ears swiveling as if listening for something. Each time, he would glance back at Sarah, his expression reassuring. "You've got a plan, don't you?" she said, her voice soft. "I hope you do, because I'm all out of ideas." They walked for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. The forest seemed endless, its twisting paths and thick underbrush making it impossible to keep track of their direction. Sarah's feet ached, her energy waning with every step. Just as she was about to suggest they stop and rest, Max froze. His body went rigid, his ears standing at attention. He sniffed the air, his tail wagging furiously. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her heart leaping into her throat. Max barked, a joyous sound that echoed through the trees. He darted forward, his movements swift and confident. Sarah hurried after him, her breath catching in her throat as she caught sight of what he had found. There, nestled in a small clearing, was a rustic cabin. Smoke curled from its chimney, a thin plume that disappeared into the overcast sky. The sight was almost too good to be true, a beacon of hope in the middle of the wilderness. "Max, you genius!" Sarah exclaimed, tears of relief streaming down her face. Max barked again, bounding up to the cabin's porch and pawing at the door. Sarah stumbled after him, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She knocked on the door, her fists weak but persistent. "Hello? Is anyone there?" she called, her voice cracking. The door creaked open, revealing an older man with a kind face and a weathered appearance. He looked startled to see Sarah and Max, his eyes widening as he took in their disheveled state. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed, stepping aside to let them in. "What happened to you?" "It's a long story," Sarah said, her voice shaky, "but we need help." The man ushered them inside, where a warm fire crackled in the hearth. He fetched blankets and hot tea, his movements quick and efficient. Sarah sank into a chair, the warmth of the room seeping into her tired body. Max curled up at her feet, his tail wagging as the man scratched behind his ears. "You're lucky to have this dog," the man said, glancing at Sarah. "He's a hero, that's for sure." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude as she looked down at Max. "I know," she said softly. "He saved my life." The cabin became a haven, a place where Sarah could finally catch her breath and process the events of the day. Max remained by her side, his presence a constant source of comfort and reassurance. In the quiet moments, as the fire crackled and the storm raged on outside, Sarah realized just how much she owed to her unlikely savior. Max wasn't just a pet. He was a lifeline, a reminder of the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Escalation of challenges, 2,000 words. The cabin offered a momentary respite, but Sarah knew their ordeal was far from over. The older man, who introduced himself as Walter, was kind and hospitable, offering them food, warmth, and shelter. Yet as Sarah rested, sipping the steaming tea he'd prepared, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of danger. Just yet. The storm outside showed no signs of abating. Though the rain had lessened, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of the small cabin. Max lay by the fire, his eyes alert despite his apparent relaxation. Every so often his ears would twitch, and he would lift his head, sniffing the air. "I can't thank you enough for letting us stay here," Sarah said to Walter, her voice steadying after the warmth of the tea. "No thanks necessary," Walter replied, sitting down across from her. "This forest has seen enough tragedy. Glad I could help someone avoid becoming another story." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Tragedy?" Walter nodded solemnly. "These woods have a reputation. Dangerous terrain, unpredictable weather. Folks get lost, stranded, or worse. Rescue crews only come when the weather clears, and that can take days." The weight of his words sank in, and Sarah's chest tightened. She glanced at Max, who returned her gaze as if sensing her unease. "I have to get back," she said, determination hardening her voice. "My family doesn't know where I am. They'll be worried sick." Walter frowned. "You're in no condition to travel. It's miles to the nearest road, and with the storm it's too dangerous. Better to wait it out here." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Max's sudden growl stopped her. He was on his feet, his body tense as he stared at the cabin door. "What is it, boy?" she asked, her heart pounding. Walter stood, grabbing a flashlight from a nearby table. "Probably just an animal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The growl in Max's throat deepened, his fur bristling. Sarah moved closer to him, placing a hand on his back to calm him. Walter opened the door cautiously, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the rustling trees. Then a low, guttural sound echoed from the shadows, a sound that made Sarah's blood run cold. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Walter shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know. Stay inside." He stepped out onto the porch, the door creaking as it closed behind him. Sarah watched through the window as he swept the flashlight back and forth, its beam slicing through the darkness. Max pressed against her leg, his body taut with tension. Minutes felt like hours as Sarah waited, her breath catching every time. The wind howled or a branch snapped outside. Finally Walter returned, shutting the door firmly behind him. "Nothing out there," he said, though his face betrayed his concern. "Probably just a coyote or a wolf passing through." Sarah wasn't convinced, and neither was Max. He remained on edge, his eyes fixed on the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. The night dragged on, each sound outside magnified by the stillness within the cabin. Sarah tried to rest, but her mind raced with worry. What had made that sound? And why did it leave her feeling so unsettled? As dawn broke, the storm began to clear. The rain stopped, and the wind calmed, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Walter prepared a simple breakfast, but Sarah's appetite was non-existent. "I think it's time for us to go," she said, her voice firm. Walter hesitated. "Are you sure? The trails are still slippery, and you don't know these woods." "I don't have a choice," Sarah replied. She looked at Max, who seemed to nod in agreement. "We'll take it slow, but we need to move." Walter reluctantly packed a small bag with supplies, water, food, and a map of the area. "Follow the markers on the map, and you'll eventually hit the main road," he instructed. "But be careful. The forest has a way of turning people around." Sarah thanked him, her gratitude genuine despite her growing anxiety. With Max at her side, she stepped out into the damp morning air. The forest felt different now, quieter, yet somehow more menacing. Navigating the forest, the path was treacherous, the mud slick beneath Sarah's boots. She leaned heavily on a walking stick Walter had given her, each step a struggle against the uneven terrain. Max stayed ahead, his nose to the ground as he sniffed out the safest route. Hours passed as they trudged through the forest. The sun remained hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting a dim light that made it difficult to navigate. Sarah checked the map frequently, but the twisting paths and dense foliage made it hard to orient herself. "We're going the right way, aren't we, Max?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Max barked once, his tail wagging as if to reassure her. But as they pressed on, the feeling of unease returned. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees taller and their branches more gnarled. Shadows danced across the ground, playing tricks on Sarah's tired eyes. A sudden rustling sound made her stop in her tracks. She froze, her heart pounding as she scanned the area. Max growled softly, his ears pinned back. "Is someone there?" Sarah called, her voice echoing through the trees. There was no response, only the faint rustle of leaves. Sarah gripped her stick tightly, her knuckles white as she strained to see through the thick underbrush. Then, without warning, a figure emerged, a large, shadowy shape that moved with an eerie silence. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized it wasn't human. It was an animal, its form massive and its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Max barked furiously, placing himself between Sarah and the creature. His stance was protective, his growls low and menacing. Sarah's mind raced. What was it? A bear? A wolf? Whatever it wasn't friendly. "Easy, Max," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Stay calm." The creature took a step closer, its presence overwhelming. Sarah could feel the weight of its gaze, the primal fear it invoked, making her knees weak. Suddenly, Max lunged, barking with a ferocity Sarah had never seen before. The creature recoiled, letting out a guttural snarl, before retreating into the shadows. Sarah collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with adrenaline. Max returned to her side, licking her face as if to comfort her. "You saved me again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The encounter left Sarah shaken, but she knew they couldn't afford to stop. She clung to Max's lead, his unwavering determination the only thing keeping her moving. The terrain grew steeper as they climbed a rocky incline. Each step was a battle against exhaustion, but Sarah refused to give up. She focused on Max, his steady pace a source of strength. At last, they reached the top of the hill, and Sarah let out a cry of relief. Below them, she could see the road, a narrow strip of pavement cutting through the forest. "We made it," she said, tears streaming down her face. Max barked, his tail wagging furiously. The descent was just as treacherous, but the sight of the road gave Sarah the motivation she needed. When they finally stepped onto the pavement, she sank to her knees, overcome with emotion. A car approached, its headlights cutting through the gloom. The driver stopped, rolling down the window with a look of concern. "Are you okay?" they asked. Sarah nodded, her voice breaking as she replied, "We're okay, thanks to him." She looked down at Max, who sat beside her, his eyes shining with loyalty and love. As Sarah and Max navigated the forest, the bond between them deepened further, but a lingering question began to take root in Sarah's mind. Who was Walter, really? And what had he meant when he spoke of the forest's reputation? Walter's parting words echoed in her ears as she trudged forward, the map clutched tightly in her hand. "The forest has a way of turning people around." His tone had carried a weight that Sarah couldn't ignore. What did he know that he wasn't saying? Max, ever perceptive, seemed to sense her unease. He stayed closer than usual, occasionally, glancing back at her as if to reassure her that they were still on track. As the day wore on, Sarah stumbled upon something unexpected, a clearing marked by unnatural symmetry. In the center stood a weathered signpost, its wooden planks carved with strange symbols. Surrounding the post were remnants of what looked like personal belongings, an old backpack, a rusted watch, and a tattered journal. Sarah's breath hitched. These weren't items left behind by hikers. They were relics, abandoned as if their owners had vanished. She knelt and picked up the journal, brushing off dirt and leaves. The cover was damp, and the pages inside were smeared, but some entries were still legible. Day 3. The forest feels alive. It's as if it knows I'm here. I thought I saw someone last night, a shadow moving between the trees, but no one answered when I called out. The map is useless. Every path looks the same. Sarah shivered as she read the words. The entry was dated 5 years ago. She flipped through more pages, her heart sinking with each cryptic passage. Day 7. I'm not alone. I hear footsteps, whispers. I'm scared. If anyone finds this, please tell my family I tried to make it out. The last entry sent a chill down her spine. Day 10. I can't trust the forest or myself. I see people, but they're not real. I think it wants me to stay. Max barked sharply, snapping her out of her thoughts. He stood a few feet away, his ears pinned back and his tail low. His body language was clear. They weren't safe here. Sarah reluctantly set the journal down, her thoughts racing. Walter had mentioned the forest's reputation, but he hadn't gone into detail. Did he know about the people who had vanished here? Did he know why? Her mind drifted to Walter's cabin. The old man had seemed kind, yet there had been something about his demeanor, a cautiousness, a guardedness that now seemed suspicious. What if he wasn't just a hermit living off the grid? What if he was tied to the mysteries of this forest? Come. On Max, Sarah said, rising to her feet. We need to keep moving. As they pressed forward, Sarah's thoughts remained on the journal and the clearing. The symbols on the signpost nagged at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were more than decorative carvings. What if they were warnings? Or worse, what if they were some kind of marker? The forest seemed to shift around them, the paths becoming harder to follow. She checked Walter's map frequently, but her surroundings never quite matched the landmarks it depicted. Frustration bubbled to the surface. This doesn't make sense, she muttered. Max whined softly, nuzzling her hand. His steady presence grounded her, keeping her from spiraling into panic. That's when she spotted it, a second signpost, nearly identical to the first. This one was partially obscured by overgrowth, but the symbols were the same. Near its base lay another abandoned item, a compass, its needles spinning erratically. Sarah's stomach churned. She was no longer sure if she was walking in circles, or if the forest itself was changing, rearranging its paths to confuse her. As dusk approached, Sarah and Max stumbled upon a small campsite. A fire pit, long extinguished, sat in the center, surrounded by a few scattered belongings. A faded photograph lay among the debris, its edges curled and its image barely discernible. She picked it up carefully, her breath catching when she saw the face in the photo. It was Walter, much younger but unmistakably him. "What is this?" she whispered. Max sniffed the air, his ears perked as he glanced around nervously. A soft, rustling sound came from the trees behind them. Sarah turned sharply, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, her clothes torn and her face gaunt. She looked at Sarah with wide, haunted eyes. "You shouldn't be here," the woman said, her voice barely audible. Sarah took a cautious step forward. "Who are you? What happened to you?" The woman shook her head, backing away. "It doesn't let you leave. It keeps you until there's nothing left." Before Sarah could ask more, the woman vanished into the forest, her movements unnaturally quick and silent. The encounter left Sarah shaken, but resolute. Walter's connection to the forest was undeniable. The photograph, the journal, the mysterious woman, all pointed to a deeper truth, one that Walter hadn't shared. She thought back to his words. This forest has seen enough tragedy. Was he trying to warn her, or was he part of the reason people disappeared here? Max barked, drawing her attention to the path ahead. Despite her fear, she knew she had to keep moving. She couldn't afford to stop now. This subplot adds layers to the main narrative, introducing an element of mystery that deepens Sarah's journey. Walter's enigmatic role and the forest's supernatural qualities create a sense of foreboding, forcing Sarah to confront not only physical challenges but also the psychological toll of the unknown. The subplot ties back to the main theme of resilience, as Sarah must push through her doubts and fears to survive. Max's unwavering loyalty serves as a counterbalance to the forest's malevolence, reinforcing the bond between human and animal as a source of strength in the face of adversity. Would you like to expand on Walter's backstory or delve further into the forest's supernatural elements? The dense canopy overhead grew darker as storm clouds rolled in, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a warning of what was to come. Sarah quickened her pace, her breath ragged. The map Walter had given her felt increasingly useless, its landmarks and paths rendered meaningless in a forest that seemed to twist and shift with every step. Max remained at her side, his instincts sharper than ever. His growls were low and frequent, his body tense, as if he could sense an impending danger that Sarah couldn't see. Then it happened. The air grew unnaturally still, and an oppressive silence fell over the forest. Even the distant sound of thunder seemed to vanish. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. "Max, do you feel that?" she whispered. Before she could react, a deafening crack of thunder split the silence, and a bolt of lightning struck a tree just ahead of them. The impact sent a fiery branch crashing to the ground, blocking their path. The flames illuminated the forest, casting flickering shadows that danced menacingly. But the fire wasn't the most terrifying thing. Emerging from the smoke and shadows was a figure, Walter. His weathered face was illuminated by the firelight, and his expression was a mix of sadness and determination. He held a lantern in one hand and a carved staff in the other, its surface etched with the same symbols Sarah had seen on the signposts. "You shouldn't have come this far," he said, his voice carrying a strange resonance. "The forest, it doesn't forgive intrusions." Sarah's fear turned to confusion and anger. "What are you talking about, Walter? You sent me this way. You gave me the map." Walter's eyes softened, but his grip on the staff tightened. "I was trying to guide you out, but the forest has its own will. It took your arrival as a challenge. Now it won't let you leave." "What do you mean it won't let me leave? It's just a forest." Walter shook his head. "No, Sarah, it's alive, not like you or me, but alive in a way that's older and darker than we can understand. It feeds on fear, on despair. That's why so many have vanished here." As if to punctuate his words, the ground beneath them trembled, and a cacophony of creaking wood and snapping branches echoed through the forest. Trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted roots and limbs writhing like living creatures. Max barked furiously, placing himself between Sarah and the encroaching forest. His growls were fierce, his body a shield of loyalty and courage. "What do we do?" Sarah shouted over the chaos. Walter looked at her, his eyes filled with both regret and resolve. "We fight it, together, but you have to trust me." Sarah hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Fine, tell me what to do." Walter handed Sarah the lantern. "This flame is the only thing that can hold the forest back. Keep it burning no matter what happens." "What about you?" Walter raised his staff. "I'll draw its attention. Max will guide you to safety. Follow him, no matter where he leads you." Sarah's throat tightened. "You're coming with us, right?" Walter gave her a sad smile. "I've been in this forest too long. It already has a part of me. But you can still make it out." Before she could protest, Walter struck the ground with his staff, and the symbols carved into it glowed with an otherworldly light. The forest responded with a deafening roar, its branches thrashing violently. "Go!" Walter shouted. Max barked urgently, tugging at Sarah's sleeve. Reluctantly, she turned and ran, the lantern held tightly in her trembling hands. The forest seemed determined to stop her, its roots rising from the ground to trip her and its branches reaching out like claws. But Max was relentless, darting ahead and barking directions, as if he knew the forest's every secret. Sarah trusted him completely, her faith in his instincts her only anchor in the chaos. Behind her, she could hear Walter chanting in a language she didn't recognize, his voice rising and falling like the rhythm of the storm. The forest's wrath seemed focused on him, the air crackling with energy as he fought to hold it back. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah and Max burst into another clearing. This one was different. Its edges were bordered by a river, and in the center stood an old, rickety bridge. The lantern's light flickered, casting long shadows across the rushing water below. "This has to be it," Sarah murmured, her voice trembling. Max barked and nudged her forward. The bridge swayed dangerously under her weight, each step a gamble. The river below roared, its current swift and unforgiving. Sarah's heart pounded as she clung to the ropes, the lantern's flame flickering with each gust of wind. Just as Sarah and Max reached the other side, the forest let out a final, earth-shaking roar. She turned to see the clearing behind her, consumed by darkness, its edges glowing with the light of Walter's staff. His figure was barely visible now, surrounded by the writhing limbs of the forest. But even from a distance, Sarah could hear his voice, steady and resolute. "Go, Sarah. Live your life." The lantern's flame flared brightly, and then everything went silent. The oppressive energy lifted, replaced by a stillness that felt almost peaceful. Sarah stood at the edge of the bridge, her chest heaving and her mind racing. Max whined softly, nudging her hand as if to reassure her. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Thank you, Walter." As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, Sarah realized they were no longer in the forest. The trees had given way to open fields, and the air felt fresh and free. She collapsed to her knees, wrapping her arms around Max. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with equal parts relief and sorrow. Max licked her face, his tail wagging gently. Days later, Sarah returned to the edge of the forest, now marked with cautionary signs. She held the journal she had found, determined to share its story and Walter's sacrifice. The experience had changed her profoundly. She no longer took life for granted, and her bond with Max had deepened in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Walter's words stayed with her. The forest doesn't forgive intrusions. She knew she would never venture into it again, but she also knew she couldn't let its secrets remain hidden. Standing at the edge of the forest, Sarah whispered a silent prayer for Walter and all the others who had been lost. She placed a small, carved figurine, one of the symbols from Walter's staff, at the base of a warning sign. "This is for you, Walter," she said softly. "You'll never be forgotten." As she turned to leave, Max barked once, a solemn yet hopeful sound. Together, they walked away, the forest behind them and a new chapter ahead. Weeks had passed. Since Sarah's harrowing escape from the forest, life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but Sarah found herself profoundly changed. She no longer hurried through her days with the same blind focus. Instead, she took time to appreciate the small things, the warmth of the sun on her face, the sound of birdsong, and most importantly, the unwavering presence of Max by her side. Max had become more than just her companion. He was her guardian, her confidant, and a constant reminder of the strength they had both shown in the face of overwhelming odds. Sarah had started keeping a journal, writing down every detail of their journey to ensure the memories would never fade. The lantern Walter had given her sat on the mantel in her living room, its glass polished and its brass frame gleaming in the sunlight. She had never lit it again, not wanting to disturb the sacred energy it seemed to carry. Yet every time she looked at it, she felt a sense of peace and gratitude. It had become a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest of times there was light to be found if one had the courage to seek it. News of Sarah's experience spread through her small town. At first, people were skeptical, dismissing her tale as a wild exaggeration or the result of stress and exhaustion. But when Sarah presented the journal she had found in the forest, along with the symbols carved into the lantern and Walter's staff, doubt began to fade. The town organized a gathering to honor the lives lost to the forest and to share the lessons Sarah had learned. She stood before the crowd, her voice steady but filled with emotion as she recounted her journey. I went into the forest looking for answers, but I came out with something far more valuable, a renewed appreciation for life and the connections we share, not just with each other, but with the world around us. Her words resonated deeply, and the town decided to erect a small monument at the forest's edge, a simple stone engraved with Walter's name and the words, "A guide in the darkness, a light for the lost." Sarah and Max spent more time outdoors, exploring trails and open fields where the light of the sun always shone. Their bond had grown unshakable, forged in the fires of their shared ordeal. Max had become more attuned to Sarah's emotions, often comforting her with a nuzzle or a gentle paw when he sensed her sadness. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Sarah found herself reflecting on everything they had endured. "You saved me, Max," she whispered, scratching behind his ears. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Max wagged his tail in response, his eyes filled with the unconditional love that only a dog could offer. Though the forest was now off limits, Sarah often found herself drawn to its edge, not out of fear or curiosity, but as a way to honor the lessons it had taught her. She realized that life, much like the forest, was unpredictable and often daunting, but it was also beautiful and filled with opportunities for growth and connection. She began volunteering at an animal shelter, helping dogs like Max find loving homes. The work brought her immense joy and a sense of purpose, allowing her to channel her gratitude into something meaningful. On quiet nights, Sarah dreamed of Walter. In her dreams, he was always standing at the edge of the forest, his staff glowing faintly. He never spoke, but his presence was comforting, as if he were watching over her and Max. One particular dream stood out. In it, Walter handed her a small wooden carving of a tree, its branches reaching upward as if trying to touch the stars. When she woke up, she felt a deep sense of peace, as if Walter's spirit had finally found rest. 1 year after her escape, Sarah and Max returned to the forest's edge. The monument stood tall, surrounded by flowers and small offerings left by townsfolk. Sarah knelt before it, placing the wooden carving from her dream at its base. "Thank you, Walter," she said softly, "for everything." Max sat beside her, his tail wagging gently, as if to echo her gratitude. Sarah's story inspired others to see the forest not as a place of fear, but as a reminder of life's fragility and resilience. The town began organizing annual walks and gatherings in nearby fields, celebrating the natural world while respecting its boundaries. Children often asked Sarah to share her tale, their eyes wide with wonder as she described Max's bravery and Walter's sacrifice. She always ended her story with the same words: "Courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about facing your fears and finding the strength to move forward, no matter how dark the path may seem." One evening, as Sarah sat by the fire with Max curled up at her feet, she noticed the lantern flicker faintly. She stared at it, her heart skipping a beat. For a moment, she thought she saw Walter's reflection in the glass, his face serene and content. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "You'll always be with us," she whispered. Max lifted his head, his ears perking up as if he too had sensed something. Years later, Sarah's story became a legend in the town, passed down through generations. The forest remained a place of mystery, its secrets respected but never forgotten. Max lived a long and happy life, his loyalty and bravery forever etched in Sarah's heart. When the time came to say goodbye, Sarah buried him in the field they had visited so often, planting a tree in his honor. As the years went by, the tree grew tall and strong, its branches reaching upward as if trying to touch the stars. A living testament to the bond between a woman, her dog, and a man who had shown them the way through the darkness.